the problem, especially the topics I write about, are, unfortunately very controversial. Even though I'm never consciously trying to be controversial. I'm often just trying to say things that would make sense if I were talking to a smart friend about a particular issue.
Mm-hmm.
But the way American history has gone, it just turns out. Well, let me put it this way: every society in history has had its set of deep taboos, of subjects that are extremely emotionally charged, and what particular subjects those are have varied, as much as possible. So that, I was recently reading Tocqueville, and there's a sentence he has at the beginning of a chapter. He's writing in the 1830s from the perspective of a Frenchman. And he says something like, "What I'm about to say will no doubt offend people immensely." And then he goes on to say something sort of very innocuous sounding about like democracy and separation of powers or something. Something that would go down smooth with, whether or not you agreed with it, would go down smooth from like a fence taking perspective with any modern observer. And I thought that was funny because, he was clearly bracing himself for a blow for saying something that just sounded totally commonplace. And when you live in a particular society that has a particular set of taboos, it's hard to create the distance from which you can view the taboos of your time as ultimately arbitrary. But I do try to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like you're not trying to stir up controversy, but the things that you write about and the way in which you write about it, it's like we don't have a language to discuss some of these things without seeming controversial or without people making assumptions about you. And yeah, like it just seems like in a lot of areas we lack the language to talk about things. Like I was just I was listening to Eric Weinstein talk to the author of Hillbilly Elegy, and I apologize because I'm blanking out on the author's name.
J.D. Vance.
Yes, yeah. And he was talking about how now we don't really have a language for talking about the struggles of middle class white America. And it's hard for a white person to talk about the struggles of middle class whiteness without seeming like you're disregarding black people or some other race. Like to just talk about it and acknowledge it without seeming like you're coming from some like you're asking for anything in return. And you also write a lot about race in America, and you've talked about the problem of violent crime in the black community, and that also seems like a subject where there's a disconnect between the facts and what people are willing to talk about just because something seems controversial, or we don't have a language to talk about it. Like the mainstream concerns of racism, the mainstream concerns of anti-black racism don't match the real life suffering of black people. And so if you took those two things and you matched up police shootings, which is awful. If a black kid gets shot for no reason by a police officer and he was killed wrongly, that is not happening in huge numbers, yet it takes over the majority of the mainstream discussion. But something like violence in the black communities and black on black violence and why are black teenagers killing each other happens much more frequently, yet no one talks about it. And when you take something like what J.D. Vance was talking about, like the struggles of a white middle class America and the struggles of being a black kid growing up in, you know, Southside Chicago or wherever and worrying about not getting shot by another black kid because that's who you really have to worry about shooting you. It's like we don't have the language to discuss that.
Yeah, we've certainly since the 1960s we've become very good as a country, especially elites and the media, at having the conceptual vocabulary to understand when a white person kills a black person because they were afraid or biased or racist. When an event like that happens, it gets elevated to a national story. People understand it instinctively as evil. It gets condemned by the most important politicians in the country. And it's understood as a massive concern and something that should be avoided and something that we should devote time and attention to preventing. But we really don't know how to talk about the fact that murder is the number one cause of death for young black men. And it's not the number one cause of death for any other race of young men. And, you know, not only is it the number one cause of death, it's a larger cause of death, you know, for black men in their early 20s than the other top 9 causes combined. So, you know, the problem is the moment you begin mentioning this, I think many people, the hair on their skin begins to raise. And they begin picturing the ugly history of criminalizing black men. And so it becomes impossible to say, this is actually the much bigger problem. You know, it's not just the lives lost. It's the fact that in high crime communities, businesses don't want to enter and open branches in those communities. Grocery stores have to charge higher prices to compensate for theft and burglary. And therefore, people in those neighborhoods pay more for the same things. There are fewer jobs because businesses won't move in. You know, crime has a cost that is really massive and underreported. If you own property in a high crime community, as many black people do, the value of that property is almost directly tied to the crime rate. But inversely, as the crime rate goes down, your property value will go up. So if we care about the racial wealth gap, as it's often framed, you know, it's inconsistent to not care about crime, and in particular violent crime. But you're right when you say we don't have the sort of pat, simple concepts and phrases to understand or care about these, you know, these issues in the media. You know, there's when a black kid kills another black kid, you know, you just don't see Rachel Maddow and, you know, everyone on CNN, you know, making a stink about it, which they will do if, you know, if a white person kills a black person. But that's, you know, ultimately a life is a life. And everyone would acknowledge that fact in the abstract, but we actually behave as if it really matters whether a person was killed by someone with white skin or someone with black skin. And that's something we have to get over.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what it is. And you know, you mentioned Rachel Maddow. A lot of the things she says, granted, are calculated to excel in the structure and corporations that she's a part of. So she's doing what she has to do to get attention. But I don't think her lack of talking about black kids getting shot has anything to do with her not seeing the humanity of black people. Like, I think if you played videos for people of a black kid getting shot and a white kid getting shot, I don't think there would be much of an observable difference in their emotional reactions and the things that kind of go on in their brains. And maybe they've done studies on racial violence. I'm sure they have. I'm just not aware of the results, but I would think that most people's emotional reaction would be pretty similar where they see people of different races getting harm done to them, where that would generate a very emotional reaction where you want to stop this. Like, you empathize with that person and you say, what can I do to stop this? But then I think a lot of white people, especially in the media, do calculations of, if I talk about this, how racist will I seem, even if this is something that I know it deserves to be talked about, that I know is harming black people, that I know is an issue that if we dedicated more media time to it would improve human lives. How racist will I seem to how racist will I be perceived as when I start talking about this? And many times I think that calculation, whatever the critical mass of that calculation is, like, outweighs their willingness to talk about these problems. Like, I heard Mark Norman make a joke that illustrates this. It was pretty funny. He said, if he sees a white person walking down the street, and Mark Norman is white, for those people who are listening that haven't seen his comedy, he says, if I see a white person walking down the street and they're wearing a sketchy outfit, like they're wearing a hood, they have both hands in their pockets, they just have sketchy body language, and if it's a white person wearing that and acting like that, he'll cross the street and not think twice about it. But if he sees a black person wearing the same outfit, same body language, like same sketchiness, demeanor, before he crosses the street, if anyone is around him, he will think, and even the person who's the actual guy walking towards him or girl walking towards him, he will think, how racist does this make me look right now if I cross the street? And the joke was that I'd rather get stabbed than look racist. But I think that's, like, kind of true. Like, a lot of white people think that way, and when you're on the media, that's even magnified more. Like, if I start talking about this, or if I do this, even though I know it's preserving human life, whether it's my own or someone else's, how racist am I going to seem when I do this? And that acts as a barrier.
Definitely. And from each person's rational self-interest, I can understand why you would want to do almost everything in your power not to seem racist in the year 2020, especially at a time when we've defined racist so widely as to encapsulate a whole set of behaviors that wouldn't have been seen as racist by even the civil rights era leaders like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin. So, if you think about what's, given that homicide is the number one cause of death for young black men, you would expect that in the era of Black Lives Matter, if that slogan means anything, that there would be some kind of nationwide movement to find wise, ethical solutions to this problem. Similar to how we attacked drunk driving in the 80s, and you had groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving that sort of gained national attention for, and much deserved national attention for sort of being the the ethical face of this movement. You know, thinking of a mother who lost her son or daughter because, you know, someone got behind the wheel of a car drunk. You know, there's another group called Mothers Against Senseless Killings, plural, which is a group of mostly black mothers who have, in many cases, lost their children to stray bullets, which happens all the time as a result of, you know, gang warfare. And if you were to ask, you know, why is it that a group like Mothers Against Senseless Killings, which, you know, no sane person could ever say, you know, that's not an important group. Why isn't it that they have the kind of national profile that Mothers Against Drunk Driving has? And the answer is very simple. Drunk driving, of course you can find drunk drivers of every race, but disproportionately it's a white crime if you look at the FBI data. When you picture a drunk driver, the face that comes to mind, frankly, is a white male. And that's a picture that's, you know, it's a stereotype, but it's a true stereotype to the extent that you look at the rates of of drunk driving by race. Now, when you picture a child hit by a stray bullet, the picture that comes to mind is a black male in his 20s. And that too is a stereotype, but it's also a true stereotype in the sense that if you look at the data, you are going to find a racially disproportionate incidence of homicide by race. You know, we're talking about black Americans make up about 14% of the nation, but about 51 or 52% of both victims and perpetrators of homicide. So that's a huge disproportion. And so the simple reason why a group like Mothers Against Senseless Killings couldn't possibly have a national profile in our current cultural environment is because the perpetrators have the wrong skin color. Now, if you had to explain that to an alien from outer space, it would seem totally crazy that the level of melanin in the skin of the average person pulling the trigger would be a reason to not organize around this issue and come up with solutions. That would just sound like insanity. But that actually is the status quo. And that has to change. And unfortunately, it requires moral courage on the part of individuals to change that. But I suppose we have to demand it.
Yeah. I think comedy is also a huge part of that, too. Guys like Mark Norman that are willing to talk about it, you know, may not be able to tell those jokes on late night, but, you know, a lot of the realizations that I've come to recently, and it's probably also because I've been watching a lot of stand-up comedy in quarantine, is just looking at some of the silliness in the world through the lens of comedy. Like you were saying, if an alien came down and saw that we were treating mothers against, what was the organization again? Mothers Against Senseless
Mothers
Killings?
Against Senseless Killings.
And Mothers Against Drunk Driving differently, it would seem silly to them. They wouldn't have any concept of why that's happening. And I think comedy is good at doing that, where it kind of makes you see the silliness in things and gives you an entry point to where you can comfortably maneuver it into people's consciousness and let them kind of chew on it themselves, rather than saying, you know, you should think this way, or you need to do this in order to change the national conversation or whatever outcome it is that you desire. I think comedy and what makes great comedians so good is that they they tell jokes and they kind of slide in the silliness of our, dumb preconceived notions, or, the things that we just do traditionally that don't question our unexamined actions, like you were saying before. And they give you a perspective to laugh at them, or say, like, how fucking stupid is it that we do this, or how silly is this, or can you believe that, this is a thing that people act like this. And if that person is you, it's definitely made me think about my actions pretty profoundly, in a way that I don't know if I would have thought about them if it wasn't brought to me through, like, a comedic entrance first. If someone just told me that I was wrong, would I have thought about it the same way? I don't know if I would have.
Definitely, yeah. That's the power of comedy. If you can make someone laugh at a joke. You can make someone laugh at a joke that has a political valence that's actually contrary to a person's politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a laugh is, it can't be faked. It can't really be held down. Funny is funny.